Like, the thing that I think has gone so wrong in addiction recovery is we've taken the power away from people, and the power to trust themselves, make up their own minds, find their own path, find their own journey, make definitions that work for themselves.
Yes.
And we have to give that back to people. We have to make them the center of the process and help them become agents of their lives. Otherwise, it never will work. It's not just about keeping people off drugs. It's such a bullshit way to look at it.
Hey everyone, I'm Thais Sky. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women by women on conversations that matter. Hello everybody. Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim, the podcast. This is a podcast where we keep things real and we talk about things that matter. And so, keeping it real, I'm letting you know that I was curled up on the couch just 15 minutes ago crying. I'm navigating through some unexpected things that has felt overwhelming and has felt really terrifying and has invited me to step into decisions that I didn't think I was going to have to make in my life. And it's exhausting being human, right? It can feel really overwhelming being human. We're navigating a lot and we never really know what we're navigating until we're forced to navigate it. And yeah, so that's where I'm at, just being in the mess of it all. And something that I've learned and, I get to teach to the women at Worthy Women Rise and to my one-on-one coaching clients is that, we can't demand that the world be safe for us. I mean, we can demand it. We can do the work of wanting it. We deserve to have a world that is safe. But we also have to deal with the reality, which is that the world is very much unsafe. Unsafe in the sense that an earthquake tomorrow could separate California from the rest of the country and everyone could die. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, unsafe in that anything could happen. We can't control life. And wherever there is this desire for control, there's often a lot of rigidity, a lot of brittleness, a lot of absolutes, a lot of dichotomous thinking. And while we think that will keep us safe, ultimately, it doesn't really last. It doesn't serve us. It keeps us closed off, keeps us hard, keeps us unable to make real connections or be intimate with those around us and intimate with our lives. So, as I'm here in this mess, recognizing how little of the world I can control, how little of life I can control, and how much I would love the world to be safe, I must reconcile with the fact that the world is not safe. And yet, that does not mean that we have to harden, right? That does not mean that we have to control more. In fact, maybe the opposite is the case. Maybe the more that we meet the hardness of life, the unsafe of life, the more we can cultivate a sense of safety within ourselves so that we can soften to uncertainty. We can be more uncomfortable without that uncomfortability collapsing us because we've developed such a safe container for all of who we are within ourselves. This is the goal. This is the work, I believe. Is for us to be looking at the messy parts of ourselves, to be looking at the shadows, to be looking at the mistakes, the regrets, the resentments, the anger, and hold it all lovingly within ourselves, not push anything away. And the less that we push away within ourselves, the less we, push away outside of ourselves. And what does that look like? Maybe it looks like that we can soften. Maybe it looks like that we can hold more without overwhelm. Maybe it looks like, that we can be a little bit more compassionate to our fellow humans who are also navigating this precarious thing called life. Maybe we demand less of people. Maybe we demand less of ourselves. And wouldn't that be such a gift to be spacious with ourselves, to be able to be with all of who we are without judgment, without falling into coping mechanisms that really abandon ourselves, right? Whenever we are distrustful of our emotions, what we're really doing is we're abandoning ourselves. So I'm just sitting here in the mess with my emotions, feeling the sadness, feeling the heaviness in my heart, knowing that this will pass. And since this will pass, maybe I don't have to push it away. Maybe I can honor it and be with it and feel it. And maybe I can lean on my support system, but lean on my support system without demanding that they show up in any way, shape, or form. Maybe I can lean on them knowing that they too are limited and that they will show up in the way that they know how. And maybe right now for me, the best thing that I can do for myself is to be here. Yeah, to be here. Maybe this is where you need to be too. Maybe we can all just be here for a minute. We can just soften into the mess. I have with me Holly Whitaker. Well, not literally with me. I just act like I'm a radio show host and that I have these guests come on live. I do not have these guests come on live. They are pre-recorded interviews, but I like to think that they're here with me in spirit. So you're about to listen to Holly Whitaker. Holly is the founder and CEO of Tempest Inc., formerly known as Hip Sobriety, a consumer brand digital alternative complement to Alcoholics Anonymous. Tempest has served thousands of individuals on their path to recovery through their programs, educational courses, and media. Holly is a writer and the author of a soon-to-be-published memoir/self-help book coming out spring 2019 by Crown Publishing Group. She is also the former co-host of the Home podcast, which garnered a Webby honorable mention in 2017. She writes regularly for her own blog, Hip Sobriety, and the media site she founded, The Temper. Holly is a yoga teacher, certified both in Kundalini and Vinyasa. She loves jazz music, Rome, sleep, and oat milk. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her cat, Mary Kathleen. So we explore addiction, a variety of different ways that we can look at addiction in this conversation. And as you're listening, I would love for you to think about your own understanding of addiction, whether it's what you've seen addiction looks like out in the world, or where, your own personal experience of what addiction means to you. Maybe look at the ways that you may be addicted to things that you don't even want to admit that you're addicted to. Things like sugar, things like hating yourself, right? Sometimes we find ourselves being addicted to these things because they're easier than having to make new decisions. So something for you to be thinking about, as well as, what would you like your relationship to be with the substances that are in your life, like alcohol, like drugs, like sugar, like sitting, for those of you who are able to walk and exercise and move your body every day, how have we cultivated a society where it's okay to numb out with TV and shopping? And what would you like to, your life to look like instead? What could that look like? Just some things to think about as I bring on Holly Whitaker. Hello, Holly. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
I'm so excited to be here.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you for having me.
It is such an honor. You are such a great voice out in the world talking about recovery of addiction, right? And being sober and what that life looks like. So for people who are listening who are not familiar with you and your work, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, my background is in accounting. I mean, that's like something that I think is not necessarily like translated in my message. I graduated school and went directly into a Big Four accounting firm, and I spent, over a decade working behind the scenes. And my last job was in healthcare. And as I've always been incredibly career driven and always been incredibly good at what I do. And in my last job, I was working in a healthcare setting. I was a director of revenue cycle management, which means absolutely nothing, but I had a ridiculously hard
At least we're honest.
Yeah. And I had an experience. I was working in a company that had a really big mission of changing the way that healthcare was delivered in America. I mean, there's a huge issue with the way, like it's almost 20, like medical costs are almost 20% of our GDP, and there's so there's so many barriers to access to good healthcare. And, you know, I was working at a company whose mission I absolutely believed in. And in the middle of that, in the middle of working at this like what I thought was a mission driven company, my drinking was out of control. I'd had, you know, an almost 20-year battle with bulimia. I was a daily pot smoker, and not just like a little bit, a lot, consistently, constantly. I'd smoked cigarettes for almost 20 years. I was in severe debt. I was depressed. I did not really understand the purpose of being here on this earth. I mean, I was a really sick person. And in the middle of all of that, working at this company, I hit my bottom. I hit the point where it wasn't working, and I couldn't make it work anymore. And in this experience, I turned to the system that I was part of and creating and believed was going to fix the way that people live and thrive and get healthy. And when I went to them with this very medical problem and this very like real sickness, you said I get to say whatever. And I was shitting blood, and I was coughing up black phlegm, and I thought I was going to die by the time I was 40. I was very sick. And when I went and I saw a doctor who was a good friend of mine, an incredibly intelligent and capable doctor, she had to Google how to treat me. And my options were non-starters for me. At that time, I did not see myself addicted or as an alcoholic. I just was miserable and desperately in need of help. And so I had to get healthy on my own, and I did very quickly. This is 2012, and I stopped drinking in early 2013. And in January 2014, I stopped smoking pot and smoking cigarettes, and stopped at least purging. And so overcame this eating disorder that had been plaguing me forever, and also just really started to get in the groove of life and like understand. Just in a very short period of time, I turned my life around. And for me, it was this, moment of realizing a couple of things. One, that the way we're sold and marketed alcohol, and the way that we talk about alcohol, and the way that we talk about, like really specific, and we say that there's just a few people and they're alcoholics, and they're the ones that can't drink, but everyone else should drink. Like we are kind of living in this lie that makes us really, really sick, and that most people don't even understand that they're caught in. And so there was this like deconstructing what I would say is big alcohol, the same way as we might say big tobacco or big pharma. And also the other part of this was I really believed that there were better solutions available to us to get healthy and to address addiction, especially solutions that were not so masculine, but that were more feminine. Everything we have is from a masculine perspective, a lot, if not all, including like refuge recovery. They still are top-down approaches. They still are approaches that are based on a masculine archetype.
I was just going to ask you, like, can you name specific, like what specific things you feel are more masculine based?
Well, if you kind of think about it this way, okay? So for the most part, addiction recovery has been spiritual. That's a lot of what we've been fed is community and spirituality in terms of getting well. Only recently, in the last 20 years, we really started to take into account what happens to the brain, what happens to the body, the physiology, like the emotional impact. We are only starting to understand trauma, and we only are starting to understand trauma in terms of men, veterans versus like rape victims. All like everything you can think of when it comes to like trauma work and what's the most prevalent, like what the most used in reference materials are in terms of like trauma recovery are still focused on men and men's experience. And so, but that's not it. So the coming back to the spiritual factor of this, like most of the, like AA was something that was transmuted from, that was taken from like a fundamental Christian organization, the Oxford Group. And then like refuge recovery is something that is taking that and then putting that into a Buddhist paradigm. And when we have to think, like one of the things that is important to understand is that, basically all of our spiritual lineages, like every spiritual, like, or every religious organization or every religion that we come into contact with, that we recognize, right, is was built in like a patriarchal infrastructure, right, and system. And so it takes into account, by that it just means it takes into account the needs of men before it takes into account the needs of women. And so anyway, so when I wouldn't have had the words for this when I started this at all. I had a reaction to what I was encountering. I had a reaction to being told that if I trusted myself, that was the pathway to hell, right? That I had to give up more of my power, that I had to trust in an institution, that I had to find more discipline. There was just, I encountered these
discipline. Okay.
Fuck discipline. Fuck discipline.
It's
and
like,
so
this is our culture. Honestly, it tells us the only way we can recover from anything is to be more disciplined.
More discipline. No, I think commitment, I like to think of it in terms of discipline versus commitment. So
Absolutely.
I can get on board with commitment. But discipline, I tried discipline for years and years from my entire life. And it never worked, because discipline means discipline means fitting into a world that was made into a world that was made for men. Discipline means being able to show up. It means discounting that you're cyclical. It means discounting that you're not the same from day to day, or that you every 28 days go through a complete and total cycle. Discipline discounts what your actual experience is. And it says just, ignore that and just press on through. It's very top down. It's not bottom up. And so, fuck discipline.
It's actually interesting because I never thought to really pause and consider how addiction recovery is traditionally seen through a very masculine lens. And now that I'm hearing you talk, I'm seeing just how pervasive and true that is. And how all of the research, all of the understandings of recovery is all male-based based on the needs of men.
Well, it just comes back down to but that's true for most of the things that we experience.
True.
And it's when you talk about drug trials, well, most drug trials are performed on men. They're not performed on women. So we don't really truly understand the side effects when it hits a woman. And then the same thing goes to most things are focused on white men. Right. And so and then the last of the heap is usually Black women when it comes to this stuff. And so when we're looking at anything, most stuff is tiered in terms of who it's applicable for. And it's most firstly applicable to white men.
Yeah. So let's talk about the core of addiction. What have you found to be, at the root of most women's addiction? I know that's a very, very broad question, and you can go a number of ways, but I'm just curious to hear more about the patterns that you found amongst women that are in addiction recovery.
Yeah, I think it comes into an idea of that is such a hard question. I mean, there's so many different things, but I think it's the impossible situation most women find themselves in, no matter what that is, right? And so it's for me, I would say the root of it, there's a lot of stuff when we're talking about this, it's all these, the right explanation, the right thing to say is there is no one thing. There's something called the psychobiosocial model, and it just means that a great way of looking at it is that we all we all are born into this world, and all of us have these very unique and specific experiences and that shape us who we are. So meaning the parents that we were given, the genetic predisposition that we have, the family we were raised in, the friends that we have, the access we had, the marginalization we encountered, our peer groups, our mentors, whether or not we have the ability to self-regulate. There's all this stuff that kind of comes into play that is unique to each of us. And for most of the part, there what builds out of this experience is a level of how okay we are with ourselves and how much we need to reach outside of ourselves to make ourselves okay. And this is true for every single human. Every single human is prone to addiction. That's just, it's and when I think of addiction, it's this reaching outside of ourselves, but a pathological reaching outside of ourselves, something that a loop we get stuck in to self-correct that becomes more self-damaging. And there's a lot of different ways that you can explain addiction, but everybody reaches outside of themselves. My mom, when she feels out of control or in pain and she can't fix it, her go-to coping mechanisms are chocolate and going to the Macy's and like buying a dress. And that's a really cute and soft addiction that she might have. And I wouldn't even say it's an addiction, but it's just a coping mechanism. But for all of us, when we start turning towards something that works really, like if we have a higher level of pain and we need more help from the outside world to self-regulate, and we find something that works really well and we keep turning to that thing, what happens over time, especially if that thing is a chemical or a behavior or destructive behavior, that is that thing that we turn to over time. And if we're talking about alcohol, we use it to self-regulate. We think it works. We're like, wow, this really does the job, but it's a short-term fix that ends up exacerbating all the other issues. So a good example is if you're using alcohol and you're like, wow, this really helps with my anxiety and my social awkwardness, and this really helps with my feeling connected, is that it will give you the short fix, but then it eventually will cause more anxiety, more depression. It'll cause more disconnection. And so then because you experience more of that, you turn to the thing and then use the thing, and the thing causes more. And so it's this cycle of it. But getting back down to it, when you say like, what's the number one thing that I think, like I can boil it down. And I think honestly, it's just for me, it was that I didn't know how to be in my body. I think that's like I didn't know how to be who I was or in my body. And I think that I can say that for almost every single woman that I have worked with, or every person that I've worked with, to some degree. I didn't know how to be in this world. I didn't know how to be in my body. I didn't know how to be myself.
Yeah. Yeah, I really hear that. And I think it doesn't help also talking about the glorification of alcohol and how our culture really makes it seem like it's totally okay and normal and acceptable and sexy and glamorous to drink the amount that we drink. It's very rare to go to a social setting as adults and to not have alcohol present, or to not have an expectation that alcohol will be present. And it's like, when you're being fed that narrative that this is something that's fun and sexy and everyone's participating in it, well, then of course you want to do it. It feels good. It feels lighter. You feel great. But what is that costing you?
Yeah. Well, it costs us this idea. It's one of the things that's really interesting is that most people don't have this. They don't have this like simple recognition of that we don't have to consume alcohol, that it's actually not normal to consume it in the amounts that we do, in the ways that we do, that it's not normal to basically poison ourselves and suffer from that. Then most people don't understand that we've really set this narrative that there's only certain people that don't drink, and the rest of us are expected to incorporate this thing into our lives and make it work. Like there's something wrong with you if you go off the rails with it. There's something wrong with you if you can't, even if you can't I have friends that just don't drink because they've never been able to tolerate it. And that's even seen as odd. It's
very
normal.
Odd. It's like, like you're supposed to build a tolerance for it. Like no one likes alcohol when you first drink it, you're supposed to keep going. Obviously.
Yes. Yeah. And it's one of these things that just, we don't really slow down to think, oh wait, is this actually normal that we're drinking something that it's ethanol. It's something that's a gasoline additive for cars. It's pure rocket fuel. It's something that sterilizes medical equipment. It's what our hand sanitizers are made of. We don't really draw the parallel that that's an incredibly violent thing to do to our bodies normally without going overboard. And so it is one of the trickier things to break up with, because nobody's going to question why you want to quit cigarettes. Nobody's going to question why you want to, stop snorting cocaine or injecting heroin. And that's most people will say, yeah, stop doing that. And with this, it's like, well, maybe you can just, maybe you can just get it under control better, or maybe you could just do it less, or, it's a really crazy thing that we fight to keep it in our lives at all costs.
Yeah. So as someone who may be wanting to decrease their alcohol consumption,
Yeah.
what are some tools or things that they should be thinking about as they go and do that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that the hardest step and the bravest step in all of this, like I can examine my relationship with gluten. I can examine when I smoke cigarettes, I could examine my relationship with cigarettes. I think it's really important to understand that this is one that there's so much fear around it because people are really terrified of being an alcoholic or what it means if they have a problem with it, if they're one of them. There's a lot of fear around it. And so that one of the first things that I think is so big and brave in this is just the willingness to examine. I think if you're like able to say, is this thing doing me any favors? Is this thing helping me out? Is this thing adding to my life? And to be able to sit with those questions and not necessarily even make a change immediately, but being able to observe what our relationship is with it. Like when you come home from work, do you need it? Do you need it to be able to enjoy dinner? Like, how does it control you? How does it show up? How much do you think about it? And being able to really sit with these questions of what our relationship is with it. Could I take it or leave it? That kind of thing. And the next steps in that are just doing research around it. One of my friends, Annie Grace, has a book and it's called This Naked Mind, Control Alcohol. And it's an incredible book that helps you.
I have the book.
Do you? Have you read it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great way to just start to challenge
it's very sobering.
Yeah. And freeing. I mean, that was how I stopped. It never occurred to me that I could just stop. It never occurred to me and I don't mean that I could just stop. A lot of work went into stopping, but it never occurred to me that maybe it was not really bringing that I didn't have to drink, if that makes any sense. It was always, I hope I don't ever get to this point where I lose my drinking privilege. It was never, oh my gosh, like I don't have to do this thing. I don't have to fit this thing in my life. I actually can leave it. It actually isn't doing me, and I can look at it in a way where it's not doing me any benefits. And I read Alan Carr's book, The Easy Way to Control Alcohol, and which is somewhat similar to Annie's. And I think that's a good first step, is just starting to look at it and examine it. I think removing a lot of the shame that we have around it, allowing yourself to be where you're at, allowing yourself to still be drinking, allowing yourself to examine it and make up your mind. And I think it's really important to allow people, there's so much coercion into abstinence and I believe in abstinence from alcohol. I think it's an unnecessary thing. But I also think that people really have to be compassionately led to that in their own time, and that they have to, on the way, learn to trust themselves and be kind to themselves as they're learning to trust themselves.
One of the things that I have frustrations with abstinence is I don't have or I have not experienced alcohol addiction, but I have experienced food addiction. That's my past. And I can't abstain from food. So I feel like it was a huge gift, actually, that's what I chose somehow in an unconscious way to be addicted to, because I was forced to have to really look at it. And my now trepidations, I say this very wearily, with the abstinence only approach, is that it doesn't then invite people to really look at the underlying wound that led them into that addiction in the first place.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, abstain from heroin. Great. Don't do heroin. And can you look at, well, why did you go to that in the first place? Why did you need that high in the first place? Right? Like, what was pulling you and was so painful that you could not even look at that you went for that drug or alcohol or that behavior, etc. And so I think I just think that we need to be looking at addiction not just as the object of addiction, but also the underlying cause of addiction.
Well, absolutely, because then you never get to it. And I agree. I don't disagree with anything you just said. And
oh, good.
No. When I talk about abstinence, so let me be clear. First of all, I think there's something incredibly different between food and alcohol. You can't live without food. You really can live without alcohol. And so that is something that you can develop a black and white relationship with. And I think from my experience with this, a black and white relationship with it, like removing it, there's so much, one of the things that Annie talks about in her book is, oh my God, I want to keep saying confirmation bias, oh my God, why can't I think of the name of it? It's when we have like two different thoughts, like when we think two different things equally, when we have a conflicting,
Cognitive dissonance.
Thank you. Why the fuck can I? Yes, cognitive dissonance, and it's one of the most painful places to be. Like going back and forth around this. You can't really get through. Like cognitive dissonance is not something that you can really apply and get through when it comes to food. I can make the decision I'm not going to stick my fingers down my throat, but I can't really make the decision. Like I can't have a black and white decision around food. I can't abstain from food, and I can't put any restrictions around my food. I have to be really careful about that. Otherwise, I send myself, off the rails. With alcohol, it is like a lot of peace comes from not having to think about alcohol. Like there's so much freedom from that. But I think like when we talk about abstinence from this, it's talking about the humane choice in this. And the humane choice in this, typically when it comes to this, is just removing the thing, but also not doing it in a way that that's the only thing that counts. Now, I want to be really clear because this is an important distinction. I think that addiction is a secondary issue. I think the primary issue is the reason we reach outside of ourselves. I think that's the root cause. And unless we address the root cause, which is our untreated trauma, which is physiological imbalances, which is our like lack of meaning, lack of purpose, like lack of community and connection. There's so many different things that lead to this discomfort within us that has to be addressed. Otherwise, we'll just find another thing to be addicted to. Yeah. And so I think it's really important to get at the root. And I don't think the goal is to have days and be sober. I think that's such a bullshit way of looking at it. And sober is this like also incredibly complex term that means something different to every single person. Like it's not just abstinence from all things ever. There's some people that will say that if you take psych meds then you're not sober, and that's bullshit. And there's some people that will, so we have to be really really careful that this is like the thing that I think has gone so wrong in addiction recovery is we've taken the power away from people and the power to trust themselves, make up their own minds, find their own path, find their own journey, make definitions that work for themselves. Yes. And we have to give that back to people. We have to make them the center of the process and help them become agents of their lives. Otherwise, it never will work. It's not just about keeping people off drugs. It's such a bullshit way to look at it. Yeah. It's just about giving people the power so that they don't have to escape from their lives.
We don't want to give people power because then they're going to go against the system because the system prefers us powerless and robot-like.
That's right. That's right. And it prefers that we think power comes from an external source. It doesn't want us to know that power comes from internal sources and that all of us are powerful. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so an intersection that I know that you've been exploring a lot is the intersection of, recovery and racism. And I would love to hear a little bit more about what you've been exploring.
Yeah. And I think this is really important to talk about. So I historically, you can't really start to delve into why we are where we are with the way that people that struggle with addiction, why they're treated the way they are without encountering the prison industrial complex, the criminalization of addiction, and also the disproportionate amount of people of color that are in prison for it. And so historically, historically addiction has been policed rather than treated. And so that just means that people end up being treated by the criminal justice system if they, specifically when it comes to the war on drugs. And so the war on drugs is something that is a complete and total transmutation of slavery. It's just an outgrowth of it, another way to keep people oppressed and out of their power and to keep us, in a racist and white supremacist society. And so that's something that you really can't, you can't look at it. Our nation is the 25th, we have 25% of the world's jailed population. Okay. And we're 5%, less than 5% of the world's total population. So we have a quarter of all not inmates, but we have a quarter of all imprisoned peoples in this country. And we have that because of our war on drugs. The numbers are anywhere from 70 to 90% of all incarcerated peoples are 70 to 9% can be traced back to drug and alcohol or drug and alcohol use or abuse, or like either they were committing the crime while they were under the influence, or they're in jail because of the possession of the substance, or it's just like there's so many ways that we can track it back to drug and alcohol. And so when you look at this, and then also you look at the number, the proportion of white people versus Black people versus Latinx, it's a no-brainer that it's like institutionalized racism. And then also if you start to dig and look at things like Ava DuVernay's movie The 13th, or if you look at The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, those are two great ways to kind of piece it together. Johann Hari wrote a book called Chasing the Scream. So there's this part of it, which is that we have used drugs and the war on drugs in order for us to basically freely police people of color and to keep racism, alive and well. But the piece of this that I think that's become more interesting, and also something that I think, you have done this, your podcast has done an incredible job of outlining white privilege and how it shows up in our lives. But one of the things that was not incredibly, so when I started exploring this and really starting to dig into racism and how it shows up in addiction, it was always at a systematic level. It was always at this large level, and it was never at this level of it's dismantle the system versus, and then there's this racism piece, right? And how we, and a good example is, I was part of something called White People for Black Lives Matter. And there was a distinction that I could talk about the systematic piece within my work in addiction. But if I was going to actually talk about racism and specifically racism, it was the separate thing, if that makes any sense. It was any activism, saying Black Lives Matter, on my social media thread or at all, talking about, I think, how we all need to recognize our white privilege and our own racist tendencies and how this shows up in our lives. I really felt that was not part of my platform, if that makes any sense. So
it makes sense because it's not in our lives, right?
It's not our living reality. Exactly. Right. We have the luxury and the privilege of being able to look the other way and not having to talk about it.
Right.
And so for a while,
well, I just want to pause there because I think for people who are listening, I think it's a great first step to be looking at systematic racism and to be looking at the ways in which white supremacy is playing a role in our systems. I think that's a great first step because I think that alone is so eye-opening for so many white people.
That's right.
Seeing how sexism and racism and homophobia plays a role in our larger systems that at least I was taught was neutral. The scientific base, it's important. That step is important. It's just then the next step, the invitation is, then how can we bring that into our lives? How can we bring an understanding of what those systems are doing in our lives and how we're perpetuating it and how our work is intricately tied to those systems. And so I love that you actually had both experience because I think that is very typical for most of us trying to navigate this new understanding.
Well, it's so interesting. I was listening to Catrice Jackson. She was on Dear Sugars yesterday, and everyone should listen to that. It was a great interview. But one of the things that white women are so afraid to talk about this on their social platforms and to bring voice to it. And Cheryl Strayed was asking her, what do you do? What do you say? Because it's because we don't know how to say it. We don't know how to say it right. And we're terrified. And her response was, Catrice, her incredibly compassionate response was, I can understand that. And also I think it's pathetic because that's your biggest fear is how people are going to react to you. That's as much as you have to lose is people unfollow you, people challenge you. And then if you're Black, if you're a person of color, then this is something you live every day and your life is at risk. And so the risks, the relative risks are non-existent, right? We have so little to lose to actually talk about this stuff, but that doesn't actually take away from the reality that most white people feel absolutely absolutely afraid, and also entirely dismissive of it, right? There's so much like, there's so much, I don't know, like there's so much disengagement around this. So, and I'm a perfect example of it. I didn't for a really long time feel like I could actually talk about racism specifically, unless I was tying it back to addiction. And one of the things that's been really pivotal for me in this year was it just got to a point where I knew I was lying to myself about it, and I also couldn't deny it anymore, and I couldn't not bring it up. And primarily because I was like 97% of the people that come through the program that I have a company, and 97% of the people that are coming through our program are white. And that's not the demographic that's getting hit the hardest with alcohol addiction. And the most vulnerable demographic is if you're a Black woman over the age of 45, you're the most vulnerable demographic. And so for me, it was, an important piece of my own journey has been, I would say just do like realizing that what my responsibility is in this. And there is a movement going on where we're speaking up and we're recovering out loud, and we're claiming, we're not hiding in basements, and we're also really challenging the alcohol industry and the messages around alcohol. And there's people like influencers on social media, and they're all white. They're all white women. And there's also this other piece of this where we're creating different recovery modalities, and that's what I'm doing. And this is taking all the things we've been talking about today is like what hurts people is that their experience is dictated or it's ignored, and when we're creating these new ways of getting sober, and we're not talking about racism and microaggressions, it means that we're discounting the actual lived experience of Black women or women of color or people of color that are trying to get sober. We're actually like, when we carve out racism from this piece, not only do we create just white spaces, but we also completely deny the experiences that make people sick, right? It's like me talking about misogyny and rape culture and how that shows up in my addiction, and saying, well, yeah, of course we can talk about that because that's important. Like there's a huge correlation between, rape trauma and addiction. And of course we say like, that's so important. And then we get to this place and we like say, well, the fact that, a Black woman recovering from addiction or trying to recover from addiction, can't find a therapist that takes the fact that she experiences microaggressions, daily, or that is, afraid of being murdered when she walks out her car, getting pulled over by a police officer when she, drive. Like we say, well, that we stop short there and we say, well, no, that's racism. That's something else. And that's outside of this specific topic. And so it's just, the point is, it's been something that's been, if we want to actually change the way that, if we want to create new systems, then we have to create systems that are like intentionally inclusive of the experiences of everybody that's experiencing the thing we're trying to dismantle, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really hear that. Was there something else? Oh, okay.
No, I'm
just
breathing. I feel like I was just talking for like an hour. No, it's just like I'm learning. That's it.
Yeah.
And that's it. I'm learning and trying not to recreate the same oppressive crap that, kept me sick. And
yeah, I think that's important. I think it's important for all of us to be looking at the ways that the things that we are teaching or the things that we are learning or the things that we are consuming, where is it coming from? Yeah. And that kind of loops back around pretty perfectly to where we were at the beginning of the conversation, which is like, I've been studying patriarchy. I've been understanding and unpacking the ways that patriarchal culture infuses my life in all sorts of ways. And I have done all my research, and I know how systemically that's a problem. And yet my brain never went to, then it makes sense that recovery models tend to be masculine based and not for women, right? So like I knew it on one level, but I didn't know it on the next level, even though it clearly clearly equals the other.
That's right.
And so it's the same thing. It's like we have to be constantly questioning everything that we are understanding and unpacking.
Yes. Why is it this way? Why does it feel this way? And what is this like? How does this affect us? And this isn't anything that Like there's, oh God, Jean Kilbourne, is that her name? She wrote a book on the influence of media and addiction. And there are women, Women for Recovery. Like there's so many different groups that have called this out before. And it's just, and it's something I really think I do believe that this is such an evolutionary path, like that we are all on, and that you can't hear certain things at a certain time. And I think that this is, for me, like for me, I couldn't really understand this, like the patriarchal piece and component of it until, the last couple of years. I would never, I knew something was wrong. I didn't have words for the thing that was wrong. And I increasingly day over day start to understand that I have words to explain why this feels bad.
Yeah. I'm curious, this is something that, let me back up. A question that I have received that I would love to know how you would answer is,
Okay.
well, I'm in the middle of my recovery. I'm in my pain.
Yeah.
I'm a white woman and I'm deeply in my pain. How can you possibly ask me to even begin looking at these systems like white supremacy and patriarchy when I'm just so deeply in my own pain?
I love this question. I'm trying to write a piece on this. So here's the answer to that. I can't. Like the work you do on yourself is the work you do on the world, right? And when people are in addiction or in any sort of like severe pain and you can't barely get out of bed, like you can't brush your teeth, you can't really take on any like world-centric causes. Like you can't take on something that's like levels ahead of where you are. You're in like, you're pretty, you're egocentric at this point. Like you can only focus on yourself. So I think it's important to understand a couple of things. When I'm including racism in this, I'm doing this as an offering to the people that can either do something with it or at a point where they've evolved. Like addiction is devolutionary. You devolve. And the recovery is evolutionary. You evolve, but you get to the floor, right? And you get pretty low sometimes. And you can't be expected to do much outside of take care of yourself. And that's always the first commandment in this, which is take care of yourself. And so there is the piece of this where it is like dangled for those that are strong enough. Like I could have never done this 6 years ago, right? I could have never talked about this or had the strength to be able to like go in and have certain conversations. Like Rachel Cargill is one of my friends and she has an incredible feed, and I can go on there and I can engage and I can engage with people and also keep my shit and also, keep my, in alignment with myself and also, act in a way to help educate and call other women in to the conversation. And I couldn't have done that a few years ago. And I think it's really important that we understand that when it comes to talking about social justice issues and racism and also recovery, that women or anybody in recovery really has to be allowed that time to work on self. Now, that doesn't mean that you get a free pass of not understanding the privilege that you hold, if that makes any sense. I think that like the bare minimum is being able to understand what privilege is and being able to, it doesn't mean you have to go within and start to recognize your own racism or do any of the like really deep and tough work. But I think it's just at least acknowledging the relative power that you hold in society and what that might do. If I am a white woman and I'm really fucked up and I'm going through recovery and I'm going through in a recovery program and there's a black woman in there with me and she's like, hey, today on the street, this is what happened and it's a microaggression. I have to be in a place where I can acknowledge that experience of that other woman. And it's the same thing. It's just it's no different than acknowledging what somebody who's in a wheelchair might have to face. That's the like baseline human, basic level, which is acknowledging the experience of other people, acknowledging the relative power that we hold in those situations and acknowledging those things exist. And I don't think that requires, I think like being able to see other people is part of the recovery, right? That's like part of our recovery is not, it doesn't necessarily challenging our own political assumptions or challenging, engaging in political activism. That's like higher level stuff. But the basic is creating, my baseline for this is I want to create spaces where anybody can walk in, through the door of any, gender, any sexual orientation, any basically any experience, and be able to be seen and not feel like their experience in this world is going to be diminished because somebody else, isn't able to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. I mean, yeah, I think that you can be in your pain and still see the pain of others,
Yes.
like one doesn't take away from the other.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Yeah. And I think it's important that in this, what I'm saying is, I think it's important to provide access to the ability to the concepts and not necessarily force the concepts, and allow people to, as they're moving through that recovery, and as they get stronger, and as they're able to look outside of their own world, that they're able to, meet themselves on the path and able to meet these things. It's not a matter of a forcing function. It's a matter of first creating spaces where we acknowledge all the different experiences that other people have, so that everybody has the same access, so that people feel included and seen, and that they're not made to feel crazy as if their experience doesn't count, or it's not happening because someone else can't understand what it is. And then I think from there, it's providing, from there, once we get stronger and we're able to be in this world, it's then, offering the different pathways to making change.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Any final thoughts before we wrap up? Anything else that you want people to know?
Oh God, I mean, so many things, but I think
all of the things.
All of the things. Yeah, I think it's, I think that one of the more exciting things about what we can look at, the way that we can approach addiction today, and all the things that we've been talking about, is just allowing people to meet it in their own time and in their own space. And I think if there's anything that I can, if there's any message I can impart, it's just, if there's anything that you feel is controlling you or smothering you, or that you're terrified to look at, that the first step is always just being able to look at the thing. It's not about necessarily doing anything with it. And that there are so many new resources and beautiful resources that are available to us today to be able to take authentic and unique paths to releasing ourselves from the things that shackle us.
And finding a way to do it in a way that's in integrity with our womanness, that is in integrity with our flow, that is integrity with our embodiment. We don't have to disembody our recovery.
That's right. We don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to take scraps.
Yes, we don't have to take scraps. I love that.
Thank you so much for this. Is the conversation I've been dying to have. So I'm really thank you. Thank you so much for having me on and talking to me about this stuff.
Thank you. I really appreciate your work in the world. It's very, the way you have a way with your writings that is so honest and so real. And I know that touches so many people, and it makes the whole process of recovery so accessible. And I think when we're in our pain and we're in the depth and despair of addiction and wounding, and there's nothing more refreshing than someone who's really real. Not painting this perfect lifestyle Instagram life of what recovery can look like. Your realness is more touching than some fancy photo.
Yeah, well, that stuff just makes you feel terrible about yourself. It just makes you feel like you're failing recovery in life. And so, I think it's really, my hero was, when I was in this, was Glennon, and it was such a contrast to some of the other people that I was following. And it was such a, when I first found her work, Glennon Doyle, it was just oh my God, I can be this messed up and talk about it. And it's incredible. It's incredible when we have that permission to be, messy.
Yeah. So, I love it. Yeah. Thank you so much, Holly.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.